July 12, 1943, Prokhorovka, Soviet Union. Obersturmführer Ernst Becker crouched behind the turret of his Tiger I tank, hands trembling as he watched something that violated every principle of armored warfare he had been taught. Through the smoke and dust of the Kursk salient, he could see them coming. Not in calculated formations, not with tactical finesse, but in a savage, suicidal wave that defied comprehension. Hundreds of Soviet T-34 tanks charging at maximum speed directly into the guns of Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. "They are insane," he transmitted to his crew. "They're ramming us." The mathematics of the miscalculation were being written not in the carefully calculated operational plans filed in Berlin, but in the twisted metal and burning hulks accumulating across an 18-square-kilometer killing ground. This was Operation Citadel, Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. The attempt to regain strategic initiative that would instead become the funeral of the Wehrmacht's offensive capability. What Bake and his comrades were witnessing was not insanity, but desperation transformed into strategy, a willingness to accept catastrophic losses that would shatter German confidence forever. 840,000 German soldiers, supported by 2,700 tanks and 2,000 aircraft, had launched the assault 6 days earlier on July 5, 1943. They faced 1.3 million Soviet defenders with 3,600 tanks and 2,400 aircraft dug into the most elaborate defensive system ever constructed. The Germans expected breakthrough. The Soviets delivered annihilation. In 12 days of combat, the German army would lose more armored vehicles than in any battle in history, transforming from an offensive force into a retreating one, never to recover the initiative for the remainder of the war. The roots of this catastrophe lay 9 months earlier in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, November 23, 1942. Adolf Hitler's headquarters, the Wolfschanze in East Prussia. The Führer stood before a map of the Eastern Front, absorbing reports that Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army was now encircled in Stalingrad. Around him, the German High Command confronted a reality that shattered their assumptions about Soviet capabilities. The Red Army, which had been pushed to the gates of Moscow and nearly destroyed in 1941, had just executed a massive pincer movement that trapped 300,000 German troops. General Kurt Zeitzler, chief of the Army General Staff, presented the strategic assessment. "The Soviets have demonstrated operational sophistication we did not anticipate. Their counter-offensive at Stalingrad was not desperate improvisation, but calculated strategy. We must reconsider our assessments of Soviet military capacity." Hitler rejected this analysis immediately. German military doctrine, refined through victories in Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia, held that superior training and tactical flexibility would overcome numerical advantages. The Wehrmacht had developed blitzkrieg tactics that emphasized rapid breakthrough, encirclement, and destruction of enemy forces through maneuver. These methods had worked against every enemy encountered. Hitler convinced himself they would continue to work against the Soviets if properly applied. What German intelligence had failed to recognize was the systematic transformation of Soviet military capability occurring behind the Ural Mountains. Stalin had relocated over 1,500 factories eastward between 1941 and 1942, creating an industrial base beyond German reach. By early 1943, Soviet tank production exceeded 2,000 units monthly, more than Germany and all its allies combined. The T-34 medium tank, initially dismissed by German analysts as crude and unsophisticated, was being produced in quantities that made quality almost irrelevant. Lieutenant Colonel Fyodor Petrov, a Soviet tank commander who would survive Kursk, described the transformation in his memoir published in 1965. "We were not the same army the Germans destroyed in 1941. Every Soviet soldier who survived that first year learned from the catastrophe. Our commanders studied German tactics, our factories copied their technology while adding Soviet innovations, and our soldiers developed a hatred that made us willing to die to stop them. By 1943, we were ready for revenge. The German decision to launch Operation Citadel emerged from desperation, masked as confidence. After losing Stalingrad in February 1943 and being pushed back during the Soviet winter offensive, the Wehrmacht needed a decisive victory to restore prestige and stabilize the Eastern Front. The Kursk salient, a massive bulge in Soviet lines extending 120 kilometers westward, offered an obvious target. A successful pincer attack from north and south could encircle and destroy 5 Soviet armies, eliminating a dangerous penetration and potentially triggering the collapse of the entire Soviet defensive line. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, initially supported the operation. His forces would attack northward from Belgorod, while Field Marshal Günther von Kluge's Army Group Center attacked southward from Orel, meeting at Kursk City and trapping everything in between. On paper, the plan appeared sound. In reality, it represented a fundamental misunderstanding of Soviet capabilities and intentions. The intelligence failure that doomed Citadel began with Soviet espionage that penetrated German planning at the highest levels. The Lucy spy ring operating from Switzerland provided Stalin with detailed information about German intentions as early as April 1943. Soviet Military Intelligence, GRU, confirmed the reports through reconnaissance and signal intercepts. By May says, the Soviet High Command knew not only that an attack was coming, but precisely where and when. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most capable commander, proposed a strategy that contradicted Soviet military doctrine but proved devastatingly effective. Rather than launching a preemptive offensive, the Red Army would prepare defensive positions of unprecedented depth, allow the Germans to attack, bleed them dry against prepared defenses, then counterattack with fresh reserves when German strength was exhausted. Let them break their teeth on our defenses, Zhukov told Stalin. Then we will break their spine. The defensive preparations that followed demonstrated the massive industrial and human resources the Soviet Union could mobilize. Across the Kursk salient, Soviet forces created 8 separate defensive lines extending up to 300 kilometers deep. Over 400,000 civilians, mostly women, worked alongside soldiers to dig 5,000 kilometers of trenches, 40,000 kilometers of barbed wire entanglements, and 6,000 kilometers of anti-tank ditches. Engineers emplaced over 500,000 mines, creating minefields so dense that some areas contained 2,400 mines per kilometer of front. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding a panzer regiment in the 21st Panzer Division, inspected the Soviet positions through binoculars in late June 1943. His reconnaissance report, preserved in German military archives, contained warnings that headquarters ignored. The Soviet defenses are unlike anything we have encountered. Multiple trench lines with supporting artillery positions, anti-tank strong points every few hundred meters, and evidence of significant armor reserves held back from the front line. This will not be a breakthrough. This will be a grinding battle of attrition that favors the defender. The delay in launching Citadel compounded the strategic error. Hitler postponed the offensive multiple times, waiting for new weapons to arrive. The Tiger III heavy tank, mounting the formidable 88mm gun, and the Panther medium tank with its sophisticated engineering were supposed to provide decisive technical superiority. The delays gave the Soviets additional months to strengthen defenses and accumulate reserves. Major Otto Carius, a Tiger tank ace who would survive Kursk with 150 tank kills to his credit, described the mixture of confidence and apprehension before the battle. The Tiger was a magnificent weapon, nearly impervious to Soviet anti-tank guns and capable of destroying any Soviet tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. We believed that it would give us the advantage. What we failed to consider was that one Tiger could only fight so many T-34s before ammunition ran out, tracks broke, or engine failed. The Soviets didn't need to destroy our tanks in fair fights. They just needed to overwhelm us with numbers. July 5th, 1943, or 4:30 hours. The German assault began with the largest artillery barrage the Eastern Front had witnessed since 1941. Over 10,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously, attempting to pulverize Soviet forward positions. The bombardment lasted 80 minutes, expending more ammunition than Germany produced in an average month. The Soviets responded with their own preparatory bombardment, launched 30 minutes before the German attack based on intelligence about German timing. Soviet artillery struck German assembly areas, causing casualties and confusion before the offensive even began. This counter-battery fire demonstrated the sophistication of Soviet military planning that German commanders had consistently underestimated. As dawn broke, German armor rolled forward into a landscape transformed into hell. The lead panzer divisions, Grossdeutschland, Totenkopf, and Das Reich, encountered minefields that channeled their advance into killing zones covered by dug-in Soviet anti-tank guns. The Soviets had developed a new tactic, establishing anti-tank strong points called pack fronts that concentrated 10 to 20 anti-tank guns in mutually supporting positions. These strong points were nearly invisible from the ground, camouflaged in trees or behind earth berms, waiting for German tanks to close to 500 meters before opening fire simultaneously. Sergeant Alexander Fadin, commanding an anti-tank gun crew, described the opening day in testimony recorded by Soviet military historians. "We waited as the German tanks approached. Tigers and Panthers led, followed by Mark IVs and infantry in half tracks. They were magnificent, advancing in perfect formation with such confidence. We let them come to 400 meters. Then the entire pack front of 18 guns opened fire at once. We destroyed 7 tanks in the first 30 seconds. The Germans scattered, some tanks reversing, others charging forward trying to overrun our positions. We kept firing until our barrels glowed red." The fighting on July 5th established patterns that would persist throughout the battle. German armor would advance, encounter prepared defenses, suffer losses, regroup, and attack again. The Soviets would defend each position until overrun, fall back to the next defensive line, and repeat. Each German breakthrough gained only a few kilometers at terrible cost, never achieving the rapid penetration that blitzkrieg tactics required. The northern pincer of Operation Citadel, commanded by Field Marshal Model, made minimal progress against defenses prepared by Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Central Front. Model's 9th Army, containing 335,000 men and 900 tanks, advanced only 12 kilometers in 6 days of brutal fighting, suffering 25,000 casualties and losing 200 tanks. By July 10th, Model informed headquarters that continued offensive operations were impossible without massive reinforcements. The southern pincer under Manstein achieved better initial results. The TUI SS Panzer Corps, containing 3 elite SS Panzer divisions with over 400 tanks, including 100 Tigers and 200 Panthers, smashed through Soviet defenses and advanced 35 kilometers by July 11th. This breakthrough created the opportunity German commanders had sought, positioning them to potentially encircle Soviet forces. The Soviet response demonstrated the depth of their reserves and their willingness to sacrifice units to prevent breakthrough. Marshal Nikolai Vatutin, commanding the Voronezh front facing Manstein's attack, committed his strategic armor reserve, the 5th Guards Tank Army under Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, to contain the German penetration. This decision led to the climactic engagement of the battle at Prokhorovka on July 12th. Prokhorovka represented the collision of fundamentally different military philosophies. German doctrine emphasized tactical superiority, achieved through superior training, better equipment, and careful coordination of combined arms. Soviet doctrine by 1943 had evolved to emphasize mass, momentum, and the willingness to accept casualties that German forces could not imagine. Rotmistrov received orders on the evening of July 11th to attack at dawn and destroy the German armor, threatening to break through to Kursk. His force consisted of approximately 850 tanks, primarily T-34s and some T-70 light tanks, facing roughly 600 German tanks and assault guns, including over 150 Tigers and Panthers. The Soviet tanks had one critical disadvantage. The open terrain around Prokhorovka offered long sight lines that favored German tanks with superior optics and guns capable of killing at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. A conventional engagement would have resulted in the destruction of Soviet armor before they could close to effective range. Rotmistrov's solution was brutally simple. His tanks would charge at maximum speed, closing the distance so rapidly that German gunners would have minimal time to fire. At close range, the numerical advantage would become decisive, and the superior maneuverability of T-34s would offset the Tiger's heavy armor and powerful guns. The tactic required accepting catastrophic losses in the approach, but Soviet doctrine by 1943 had embraced such calculations. July the 12th, 08:30 hours. The battle began as Soviet tanks emerged from assembly areas and accelerated toward German positions. Bake, commanding his Tiger, watched in disbelief as the Soviet charge developed. They were not attempting tactical maneuvers or seeking covered approaches. They simply drove straight at us at maximum speed, every tank advancing in a massive wave. It was suicidal, but it was also terrifying. The German gunners opened fire at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. Soviet tanks began exploding, their thin armor unable to withstand 80mm shells. But the Soviet formation kept coming, absorbing losses that would have caused any Western army to break and retreat. For every Soviet tank destroyed, 3 more continued advancing. The simple mathematics of the engagement meant that even with superior German gunnery, the Soviets would reach close range if they were willing to pay the price. Lieutenant Hans von Luck described the moment when Soviet tactics achieved their objective. "We were destroying them at ranges where they could not effectively return fire. My Tiger had killed 8 T-34s when suddenly they were among us, ramming our tanks, firing at point-blank range where even their 76mm guns could penetrate our armor. The battle dissolved into chaos, tank fighting tank at ranges of 50 meters or less. Our technical advantages meant nothing in that inferno." The close-range fighting that developed neutralized every German advantage except courage and training, advantages that proved insufficient against Soviet numerical superiority and equivalent bravery. German tankers discovered that T-34s at point-blank range could penetrate Tiger side armor, that ramming could disable tanks, and that Soviet tank crews were willing to sacrifice themselves to destroy German vehicles. The combat at Prokhorovka lasted approximately 8 hours on July 12th, creating a battlefield littered with burning hulks from both sides. Soviet losses were catastrophic. Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army lost approximately 400 tanks destroyed or disabled, over 40% of his strength. German losses were lighter in absolute numbers, approximately 70 to 80 tanks destroyed or damaged, but represented a higher percentage of available strength and included irreplaceable Tigers and Panthers. What made Prokhorovka decisive was not the tactical outcome, but the strategic revelation it provided. The Soviets had demonstrated they could afford to lose 400 tanks in a single day and continue fighting. Germany could not afford to lose 70 tanks in a day and sustain offensive operations. The mathematics of industrial production had created an imbalance that tactical skill could not overcome. Major General F.W. von Mellenthin, a German staff officer who analyzed the Kursk campaign in his post-war memoir, Panzer Battles, identified this fundamental reality. We had superior tanks, better trained crews, and more experienced commanders. We won the tactical engagements, destroying more Soviet tanks than we lost. But we lost the battle because the Soviets could replace their losses, and we could not. They built 2,000 tanks monthly. We built $500. No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome that industrial differential. The fighting continued for 3 more days after Prokhorovka, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. Hitler, receiving reports of massive tank losses and learning of Allied landings in Sicily that threatened the Italian front, ordered the offensive suspended on July 13th. Manstein argued for continuing the attack, believing breakthrough was still possible. Hitler refused, recognizing that Germany could not afford to continue losing armor at Kursk rates while facing threats on other fronts. The Soviet counter-offensives that followed demonstrated how thoroughly the strategic initiative had shifted. On July 12th, the same day as Prokhorovka, Soviet forces launched Operation Kutuzov against the German salient at Orel, threatening to encircle Model's Ninth Army. On August 3rd, the Soviets launched Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev toward Kharkov, the 4th largest city in the Soviet Union. Both offensives achieved breakthrough, forcing German forces into continuous retreat. The casualty statistics from Kursk revealed the human cost of the engagement. German forces suffered approximately 170,000 casualties, including 50,000 killed. Soviet casualties exceeded 800,000, including 254,000 killed, nearly 5 times German losses. By World War II standards, casualty ratios of 5.1 indicated German tactical victory. But Germany had lost the strategic battle because it could not replace losses while Soviet reserves appeared limitless. The tank losses proved even more devastating to German operational capability. The Wehrmacht deployed approximately 2,700 tanks and assault guns to Kursk and lost between 760 and 900, depending on which records are consulted. Many damaged vehicles were eventually recovered and repaired, but immediate combat strength dropped by nearly 50%. Soviet losses exceeded 6,000 armored vehicles, but production immediately began replacing them. By September 1943, Soviet armored strength exceeded pre-Kursk levels. German armor strength would never recover. The Panther tank, introduced at Kursk with great expectations, demonstrated both the genius and folly of German military technology. Technically superior to any Soviet tank with its sloped armor, 75mm gun, and sophisticated engineering, the Panther suffered from mechanical unreliability that made it unavailable when needed. Of 200 Panthers committed to Kursk, fewer than 50 were operational by the battle's end. Most lost to mechanical breakdowns rather than combat. Lieutenant Colonel Heinz Guderian, son of the famous Panzer theorist, commanded a Panther battalion at Kursk. His after-action report, preserved in German archives, revealed the technological problems. The Panther is a magnificent design compromised by inadequate testing. Engines overheat, transmissions fail, final drives break under combat stress. We lost more Panthers to mechanical failure than to Soviet fire. Until these issues are resolved, the Panther cannot be considered reliable. The contrast between German and Soviet technological philosophy demonstrated why Germany ultimately lost the war. German engineers pursued technical perfection, creating tanks with superior armor, better guns, more sophisticated fire control, and complex mechanical systems. These advantages made individual German tanks superior to Soviet equivalents in direct combat. But perfection requires time to develop and resources to manufacture, neither of which Germany possessed in sufficient quantities. Soviet engineers pursued sufficient performance combined with manufacturing simplicity. The T-34, while inferior to German tanks in most technical parameters, could be produced in massive quantities by workers with minimal training using steel of inconsistent quality. Its 76mm gun, while less powerful than German 75mm or 88mm weapons, could kill German tanks if it achieved hits. Its 500 HP diesel engine, while less sophisticated than German gasoline engines, was reliable and produced prodigious torque. Most importantly, T-34 production averaged 1,000 units monthly, while Tiger production never exceeded 100 monthly. The testimony of Soviet tankers revealed both the strengths and limitations of their equipment. Guards Lieutenant Alexander Bodnar, who survived Kursk commanding a T-34, described the experience in interviews conducted in 1975. The T-34 was a crude machine by German standards. The optics were poor, the interior cramped, the ventilation inadequate. But it was reliable, it was fast, and there were always more of them. When my tank was destroyed at Prokhorovka, I received a replacement 48 hours later. German crews who lost tanks often waited weeks for replacement vehicles. The industrial disparity that determined Kursk's outcome reflected decisions made years earlier about resource allocation and economic mobilization. Germany entered World War II with an economy only partially mobilized for war, maintaining substantial consumer goods production and resisting total economic conversion until catastrophically late. Albert Speer, appointed Minister of Armaments in 1942, increased production substantially but could never close the gap created by Soviet and American full mobilization. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had converted entirely to war production by 1942. Every factory that could manufacture weapons did so. Consumer goods production essentially ceased. The Soviet population accepted privation that would have caused revolution in Western countries. This total mobilization produced 2,000 tanks monthly, 3,000 aircraft monthly, and 4,000 artillery shells monthly by 1943. Germany, with comparable industrial capacity, produced 500 tanks monthly, 200 aircraft monthly, and 1,000 shells monthly. Major General Ivan Konev, commanding the steppe front at Kursk, reflected on this disparity in his post-war memoir. The Germans were better trained, better equipped individually, and more experienced. But we had more of everything: tanks, guns, aircraft, ammunition, men. When they destroyed our units, we brought up fresh ones. When they ran low on ammunition, they had to retreat. The mathematics was simple. Industrial capacity wins modern wars. The air battle over Kursk demonstrated similar patterns. The Luftwaffe committed approximately 2,000 aircraft to Operation Citadel, including the majority of its remaining combat-ready units on the Eastern Front. Soviet aviation mustered approximately 2,400 aircraft, including significant numbers of American-supplied aircraft and new Soviet designs that had closed the qualitative gap that favored Germany in 1941. The Luftwaffe achieved local air superiority during the opening days of Citadel, conducting ground attack missions that destroyed Soviet armor and disrupted counterattacks. Stuka dive bombers, now obsolete against Western air defenses, remained effective against Soviet forces when provided fighter escort. German fighter pilots, flying FW-190s and Bf-109s, maintained high kill ratios against Soviet opponents, but attrition ground down Luftwaffe strength just as it eroded Panzer strength. By July 12th, German air units reported 50% or lower operational readiness due to combat losses, mechanical failures, and exhaustion of flight crews. Soviet aviation, despite heavier losses, maintained operational tempo by rotating fresh units into combat and accepting lower standards of pilot training that would have been unacceptable to the Luftwaffe. Hauptmann Hans-Ulrich Rudel, Germany's most decorated pilot, who flew 2,530 combat missions during the war, participated in ground attack operations at Kursk. His memoir, Stuka Pilot, described the intensity of Soviet resistance. We flew 4 or 5 missions daily, destroying Soviet tanks and supporting panzer advances. But no matter how many we destroyed, more appeared. The Soviets had aircraft we had not seen before, Il-2 Sturmovix in formations of 50 or more aircraft attacking our armor. Our fighters shot down many, but others got through. For every Soviet aircraft we destroyed, 2 more took its place. The strategic consequence of Kursk extended beyond immediate casualties and equipment losses. The battle demonstrated conclusively that Germany could no longer achieve decisive victory through offensive operations on the Eastern Front. Every subsequent German operation would be defensive, attempting to slow Soviet advances while hoping for political settlement or technological breakthrough that never materialized. Hitler's order suspending Operation Citadel on July 13th marked the last time German forces would launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The initiative passed permanently to the Soviets, who would maintain continuous offensive operations through Warsaw, Budapest, Vienna, and ultimately Berlin. The Red Army that had nearly collapsed in 1941 had become an unstoppable juggernaut by mid-1943, growing stronger as Germany grew weaker. The human dimension of Kursk revealed the transformation of Soviet military culture. The Red Army of 1943 bore little resemblance to the force that disintegrated under German assault in 1941. Stalin's purges of the late 1930s had executed or imprisoned most experienced officers, leaving the Red Army leaderless when war came. The survivors of 1941 and 1942 had learned tactics, strategy, and operational art through brutal experience. Marshal Zhukov, the architect of Soviet victory at Kursk, embodied this transformation. A peasant's son who rose through ruthlessness and competence, Zhukov combined Soviet willingness to accept massive casualties with increasingly sophisticated operational planning. His defensive strategy at Kursk, preparing multiple defensive lines and withholding armor reserves for counter-offensive, demonstrated understanding of modern warfare that rivaled any German commander. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops after Kursk, analyzed Soviet military development in a 1944 report to Hitler. The enemy we face in 1943 is not the enemy we faced in 1941. Soviet commanders have learned from their defeats. Their tactics combine German concepts of mobile warfare with uniquely Soviet willingness to accept casualties. They have competent officers, adequate equipment, and industrial capacity that exceeds ours. We can no longer expect to defeat them through superior skill alone. The political consequences of Kursk rippled through the Axis alliance. Italy collapsed within weeks of the battle as Allied forces landed in Sicily and Mussolini was overthrown. Germany's Eastern European allies, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, observed the defeat and began considering how to exit the war before Soviet forces reached their borders. Finland, which had fought alongside Germany since 1941, opened negotiations with Moscow seeking armistice. The economic impact proved equally devastating. Germany had committed substantial resources to building the Tiger and Panther tanks deployed at Kursk, resources that could not be replaced. Each Tiger required 300,000 man-hours to manufacture, the equivalent of 5 Mark IV tanks or 15 Staugy 3 assault guns. The sophisticated engineering that made Tigers formidable also made them expensive luxuries Germany could not afford. Albert Speer, in testimony at Nuremberg and in his memoir, Inside the Third Reich, identified Kursk as the point when German industrial planners realized the war was unwinnable. The losses of armor and aircraft at Kursk could not be replaced within our production capabilities. We could have increased tank production by simplifying designs and accepting lower standards, as the Soviets did. But Hitler insisted on technical superiority, which meant complex vehicles we could not produce in sufficient quantities. The American and British contributions to Soviet success at Kursk deserves acknowledgement. Under Lend-Lease, the Western Allies provided 2,000 locomotives, 11,000 railway cars, and 375,000 trucks to the Soviet Union by mid-1943. This transportation equipment allowed the Soviets to move the massive quantities of ammunition, fuel, and supplies required for defensive preparation and offensive operations. Additionally, American-supplied radios improved Soviet command and control, while British intelligence provided detailed information about German preparations. The intelligence dimension of Kursk represented one of history's most successful deception operations. German planning for Operation Citadel was compromised almost immediately through Soviet espionage. The Lucy spy ring in Switzerland, possibly receiving information from anti-Nazi elements within the Wehrmacht itself, provided Moscow with details of German planning, including unit designations, attack axes, and timing. The Soviets utilized this intelligence not only to prepare defenses, but to execute effective deception, Operation Maskirovka. Soviet forces appeared weaker and less prepared than they actually were, encouraging German confidence. Soviet armor concentrations remained hidden through elaborate camouflage and radio silence. When German forces attacked, they expected limited Soviet reserves, but encountered 8 defensive lines and massive armored reserves. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of German military intelligence, Abwehr, warned repeatedly that Soviet defensive preparations exceeded assessments. His warnings, like those of field commanders, were dismissed by Hitler and the OKW High Command. The intelligence failure at Kursk demonstrated that German leadership had lost contact with battlefield reality, believing their own propaganda about Soviet weakness. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Kursk influenced warfare throughout the remainder of the war and beyond. The Soviet pack front tactic of concentrating anti-tank guns in mutually supporting positions became standard defensive doctrine. The concept of defense in depth, absorbing attacks through successive defensive lines while preserving mobile reserves for counter-offensive, validated Soviet operational art. German tactical responses also evolved. After Kursk, Zeitung panzer divisions increasingly operated defensively, using superior optics and gunnery to destroy Soviet armor at long range while avoiding close-range engagements where numerical superiority became decisive. The Tiger and Panther tanks proved most effective as long-range snipers rather than breakthrough weapons, a use that preserved their strengths while avoiding the chaos of close combat. The lessons of Kursk influenced Cold War military doctrine on both sides. Soviet military planners studying the battle concluded that mass, depth, and operational reserves determined outcomes in modern warfare. NATO. Planners analyzing German defensive tactics developed concepts emphasizing mobility, firepower, and technological superiority to offset Soviet numerical advantages. The legacy of Kursk endures in the wreckage still littering the Prokhorovka battlefield. Tourists visiting the site can see rusting tank hulks that neither side bothered to salvage, silent testimony to the scale of destruction. The Soviets constructed elaborate memorials celebrating their victory, transforming Prokhorovka into a pilgrimage site for veterans. Private Ernst Bacher, who survived Kursk only to die in the retreat from Hungary in 1945, wrote in a letter to his family that was recovered after the war. "We came to Kursk believing we would destroy the Soviet army and win the war. We left knowing we had lost. The Soviets were willing to pay any price to stop us, and they had the resources to pay that price. We did not. Everything that followed was merely delaying the inevitable." The transformation of German opinion about Soviet military capability paralleled the experience at Kursk. In 1941, German soldiers wrote home about easy victories over primitive enemies. By 1943, they wrote about tactical successes that achieved nothing because Soviet reserves appeared endless. By 1945, they wrote about survival, about hoping the war would end before they died in the ruins of Germany. Soviet veterans of Kursk carried different lessons. They had proven that sacrifice and determination could overcome technical superiority. They had demonstrated that Soviet industry could outproduce Germany. They had shown that Soviet commanders could match German operational art. The confidence gained at Kursk sustained the Red Army through 22 months of continuous offensive operations to Berlin. The casualty rates at Kursk would have ended the war for any previous belligerent in history. No nation in the 19th century could have sustained losses exceeding 1,000 casualties in a single battle and continued fighting. The Soviet Union and Germany absorbed such losses and fought for 2 more years, demonstrating that 20th century total war had transcended all previous concepts of acceptable cost. The question of whether Germany could have won at Kursk through different tactics or timing remains debated. Some historians argue that launching Citadel in May, before Soviet defenses were complete, might have achieved breakthrough. Others contend that by 1943, Soviet industrial and military capacity made German victory impossible, regardless of tactical execution. Field Marshal von Manstein, in his post-war memoir, Lost Victories, argued that Hitler's decision to suspend the offensive just as German forces were achieving operational success proved fatal. If Operation Citadel had continued for another week, we would have encircled the Soviet forces in the salient and achieved the decisive victory we sought. Hitler's decision to halt operations gave the Soviets time to recover and counterattack. Soviet historians and Western analysts generally reject this assessment, noting that Soviet reserves remained uncommitted when Hitler ordered the suspension. Marshal Zhukov's operational plan anticipated German breakthrough attempts and positioned additional armies behind the Prokhorovka sector, ready to contain any penetration. Even if German forces had broken through at Prokhorovka, they would have encountered fresh Soviet armies that had not yet entered combat. The mathematical reality remains compelling. Germany lost approximately 30% of its committed armor in 12 days of fighting. At that rate, the Panzer Arm would have been destroyed within 40 days, even if Soviet forces collapsed entirely. Germany could not replace lost tanks faster than combat destroyed them. The Soviets could. That industrial imbalance, more than tactical victories or defeats, determined the outcome. Kursk demonstrated that World War II would be won by the side that could sustain losses longer, produce more equipment, and mobilize larger armies. Germany had begun the war with superior training, better equipment, and more experienced commanders. These advantages eroded throughout 1942 and collapsed entirely at Kursk in 1943. What remained was a defensive struggle that Germany could not win, but could not abandon. The strategic initiative that Germany lost at Kursk never returned. Every subsequent major battle on the Eastern Front saw Soviet forces attacking and German forces retreating. The Wehrmacht fought skillfully in defense, inflicting casualties far exceeding their own losses. But defensive skill without strategic victory merely delayed defeat. In the end, Kursk stands as the definitive proof that modern industrial warfare favors the side with greater resources if both sides possess reasonable competence. Germany entered the battle with tactical and technical advantages. The Soviets possessed numerical and industrial advantages. The outcome validated the principle that quantity has a quality all its own when both sides fight with determination. Adolf Hitler, addressing German military leaders in November 1943, acknowledged the strategic reality post-Kursk. Operation Citadel was our last chance to regain initiative in the East. It failed. We must now fight defensively, holding positions while developing miracle weapons that will restore our advantage. The miracle weapons never materialized. The defensive battles merely delayed the Red Army's advance to Berlin. Marshal Zhukov, awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union for the second time after Kursk, expressed the Soviet perspective in an order read to troops after the battle. You have stopped the German offensive and proven that the fascist beast can be beaten. Now we will pursue them across Russia, across Ukraine, across Poland, into Germany itself. We will not stop until the Nazi flag is torn from the Reichstag. The promise was fulfilled 22 months later when Soviet forces raised the red flag over the ruins of Berlin. The road to that victory began at Kursk, where the Wehrmacht's last offensive died in minefields, anti-tank ditches, and the mass of T-34s charging into German guns with suicidal courage and inexorable determination. Private Tadashi Yamamoto's counterpart at Kursk was Sergeant Ivan Petrov, a T-34 commander who survived Prokhorovka despite his tank being hit 3 times. His testimony to Soviet military historians captured the essence of why the Soviets won. "We knew we would take terrible casualties. Every man in my company understood that many of us would die at Prokhorovka, but we also knew that if we broke the German offensive, the war would turn. We were willing to die for victory. The Germans fought for survival. That made all the difference." The statistical record supports this psychological assessment. Soviet forces at Kursk maintained offensive operations even while suffering casualty rates that would have caused collapse in any other army. German forces, despite tactical successes and favorable casualty ratios, were forced to suspend operations because losses exceeded replacement capacity. The side willing to pay the highest price in a battle of attrition ultimately prevailed. Kursk proved that in 20th century industrial warfare, victory requires both courage and capacity. The Germans had courage equal to their enemies. They lacked the industrial capacity to sustain losses while replacing equipment. The Soviets demonstrated that if a nation could mobilize greater resources and accept greater sacrifice, technical and tactical advantages would prove insufficient. That lesson, written in the ruins of 2,000 destroyed tanks across the Kursk salient, determined the outcome of the Eastern Front and ultimately World War II. The German dream of conquering Russia died at Kursk. What followed was merely the long retreat to Berlin, fought by increasingly desperate men with dwindling resources against an enemy that grew stronger with every passing month. The battle's conclusion came not with dramatic surrender, but with gradual recognition that further offensive operations were impossible. German forces withdrew from the salient they had contested so bitterly, abandoning territorial gains to preserve their forces. Soviet forces advanced cautiously, expecting counterattacks that never materialized because German armor losses had been too severe to permit renewed offensive action. August 23, 1943. Kharkov fell to Soviet forces for the final time, changing hands for the 4th and last time in the war. The fall of Kharkov symbolized the transformation of the Eastern Front, the city that Germans had captured in 1941 through brilliant maneuver, lost and recaptured in 1942 through desperate fighting, and briefly held again in early 1943. Now passed permanently into Soviet hands as German forces retreated westward. The retreat from Kharkov marked the beginning of the long withdrawal that would end in Berlin. German forces would fight brilliantly in defense, creating temporary crisis for Soviet operations through mobile counterattacks and expert use of terrain. But the strategic initiative remained firmly with the Soviets, who could afford to pause, rebuild, and resume operations while Germany lacked reserves for anything except reaction to Soviet moves. The final assessment of Kursk must acknowledge both the Soviet achievement and the German failure. The Soviets executed a sophisticated defensive strategy that leveraged their advantages in industrial capacity and manpower while minimizing the impact of German tactical superiority. They demonstrated that Soviet military leadership had evolved from the incompetence of 1941 to sophisticated operational art by 1943. The Germans failed to recognize that the operational environment had changed fundamentally. The blitzkrieg tactics that worked in 1939 to 1941 required achieving breakthrough against inferior opponents before they could mobilize reserves. By 1943, the Soviets had learned to defend in depth and maintain massive reserves. The very concept of breakthrough had become obsolete when the enemy possessed 8 defensive lines and unlimited reserves. Kursk stands ultimately as testament to the transformation of warfare in the 20th century. The battle demonstrated that industrial capacity, properly mobilized and directed, would overcome tactical skill. That quantity, if sufficient and properly employed, would defeat quality. That a nation willing to endure unlimited sacrifice to achieve victory would ultimately triumph over even the most skilled opponent limited by finite resources. The 900 German tanks lost at Kursk represented more than destroyed machinery. They represented the death of German offensive capability on the Eastern Front, the end of German hopes for military victory, and the beginning of the long retreat that would end in the ruins of Berlin. The 6,000 Soviet tanks lost represented an acceptable price for strategic victory, losses that would be replaced within months by the industrial juggernaut behind the Urals. Private Ernst Baker and Sergeant Ivan Petrov, one German and one Soviet, both survived the battle but drew opposite conclusions. Baker recognized that Germany had lost the war. Petrov understood that the Soviet Union would win it. Both men were correct. The mathematics of Kursk had written the ending to the Eastern Front conflict even as 22 months of brutal fighting remained before Germany's surrender. The legacy of Kursk endures not merely in military history, but in understanding how modern nations wage total war. The battle demonstrated that in conflicts between industrialized nations with comparable technology, the side that can mobilize greater resources while accepting greater sacrifice will ultimately prevail. That lesson, validated at Kursk and reinforced throughout World War II, shaped military planning throughout the Cold War and influenced strategic thinking into the 21st century. The transformation of German confidence into despair and Soviet determination into victory occurred across 12 days of unprecedented violence on the Kursk salient. What began with German hopes for decisive victory ended with recognition of inevitable defeat. What began with Soviet defensive preparations ended with offensive operations that would not stop until the Reichstag fell. Kursk was not the largest battle of World War II. That distinction belongs to the siege of Leningrad. It was not the deadliest. Stalingrad claimed more lives. But Kursk was the decisive engagement that permanently shifted the balance of power on the Eastern Front, transforming the war from uncertain contest into foregone conclusion. The battle's name resonates in military history alongside Cannae, Waterloo, and Gettysburg as engagements that determined not merely tactical outcomes, but strategic destinies. Germany entered Kursk seeking to restore its fortune. It left knowing that fortune had abandoned it permanently. The Soviet Union entered Kursk defending its survival. It emerged confirmed in its belief that victory was inevitable if sacrifice was sufficient. That transformation, written in blood and steel across the fields of the Kursk salient, determined the fate of World War II's Eastern Front and altered the trajectory of 20th century history. The Red Army that raised its flag over Berlin in May 1945 was the army forged in the defensive battles of 1941 to 1942 and hardened into an unstoppable force at Kursk in July 1943. The Wehrmacht that surrendered in May 1945 was the shadow of the force that attacked at Kursk. The finest armor, the best training, the most experienced commanders, all had been ground down in battles where tactical victories achieved nothing because the enemy could always bring up more tanks, more artillery, more men. Germany had learned that courage without resources leads only to destruction. The lesson came too late and cost too much.